The Missouri River churned muddy and restless beneath the steamboat's wooden hull as Sarah Miller stood at the railing, her gloved hands clutching a bundle of letters that had guided her halfway across the continent. The spring air carried the sharp scent of cottonwood trees and river water, so different from the salt-tinged breezes of her Boston home. Her destination, the frontier trading post of Fort Worth, lay just around the next bend according to the captain. The letters from William Thompson had painted such a vivid picture. A prosperous trading operation along the river, a sturdy home waiting for a bride, and most importantly, a kind and educated man who shared her love of literature and learning. 6 months of correspondence had convinced her to leave her teaching position and journey west. Now, as the boat approached the weathered wooden docks, Sarah smoothed her travel-worn skirts and touched the locket containing her parents' miniatures for courage. What the letters hadn't mentioned was the tension evident in the faces of the dock workers and traders gathering to watch the boat's arrival. Sarah noticed more than a few men wearing guns strapped low on their hips, their expressions wary as they scanned the riverbank. A tall man with dark hair pushed through the crowd, and her heart skipped. But this wasn't the William Thompson she'd exchanged daguerreotypes with. This man was younger, leaner, with a harder set to his jaw. "Miss Miller?" he called up as the gangplank was lowered. "I'm Jake Thompson, William's brother." His voice carried a note of strain that made Sarah's stomach clench. "We need to talk privately. Let me help with your trunks." The way he avoided her eyes as he spoke told Sarah that her carefully laid plans were about to crumble like river sand between her fingers. In the Thompson family's trading office, with its sturdy oak desk and walls lined with ledgers, Jake finally met her gaze. "William died 6 weeks ago. Fever took him fast. Too fast for me to send word." He swallowed hard. "The letters you received these past weeks, I wrote them. I couldn't bear to tell you in a letter, not after everything he'd promised you." Sarah sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "I trusted those words," she whispered, anger and grief warring in her chest. "I left everything behind based on promises that weren't even his anymore." Through the window, she could see riverboats being loaded with goods, cotton, furs, manufactured items from back east. The Thompson trading empire that was supposed to be her new home now felt like a prison of deception. Jake paced the office, his boots scuffing against the plank floor. "There's more you need to know. William's death wasn't just fever. There's corruption in this town that goes deeper than anyone wants to admit. The local law enforcement, they're working with river pirates, claiming protection fees from honest traders. Those who don't pay." He trailed off, his hands clenching into fists. "Our parents died in a robbery last year after refusing to pay. William started gathering evidence, building a case to take to the territorial governor. That's when he got sick. Too sick. Too fast. The doctor who treated him answers to James Davis, the sheriff who's behind it all." Jake's words tumbled out now, as if he'd been holding them back too long. Sarah stood, gathering her skirts to leave, but Jake caught her arm. "Please. I need your help. William told me about your father being a judge in Boston, about your own education in law. The letters weren't all lies. He truly admired your mind, your strength. We have ledgers, witness statements, everything needed to expose Davis and his men. But I can't do it alone." The river's distant murmur filled the silence as Sarah studied Jake's face, seeing now the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the desperation behind his deception. Her proper Boston upbringing screamed at her to flee, but something else, perhaps the frontier spirit she'd dreamed of embracing, made her pause. "Show me the evidence," she said finally, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "All of it. If what you say is true, these men murdered your family and are terrorizing this entire community. I won't run from that." Jake's relief was visible as his shoulders sagged. He moved to a hidden panel behind a painting, revealing a small safe. The afternoon sun slanted through dusty windows as Jake spread documents across the desk. Shipping manifest with impossible numbers, letters threatening violence, a doctor's report on William's death that Sarah's educated eye could tell was falsified. Outside, horses' hooves clattered on the street as a group of armed men rode past, led by a silver-starred figure she assumed must be Sheriff Davis. Sarah studied the documents with growing alarm, her teacher's mind cataloging each detail methodically. The shipping manifests showed far more timber and ore moving through the river port than the small operation could possibly produce legally. More disturbing were the identical signatures on different documents, clearly forged by the same hand, including what appeared to be William's name on papers dated after his death. The sheriff's been taking bribes to look the other way, Jake explained quietly, his calloused fingers tracing the edge of a threatening letter. These claim jumpers aren't just random outlaws. They're organized, with connections all the way to Silver City. William found proof they were using our dock to move stolen goods downriver, mixing them with legitimate shipments. That's when the threat started. Through the window, Sarah watched a heavily laden barge slide past on the muddy river, its cargo carefully covered with canvas. The same silver star she'd seen earlier glinted in the sunlight as Sheriff Davis supervised the loading. Her stomach twisted as she recognized several of the armed men from the wanted posters Jake had shown her among the workers. "Your brother wasn't just running a trading post, was he?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Jake shook his head, pulling out a carefully folded letter written in William's precise hand. He was gathering evidence, building a case to take to the territorial marshal. But someone warned them, the night before he was supposed to leave for Fort Worth. His voice trailed off, grief etching deeper lines around his mouth. Sarah's fingers brushed the falsified death certificate. As a teacher, she'd seen enough student forgeries to recognize the telltale signs of deception. The doctor who signed this, Thomas Henderson, he's part of it too? Jake's bitter laugh held no humor. Thomas has been in their pocket for years. Half the town is either involved or too scared to speak up. The sound of approaching horses made them both stiffen. Jake quickly gathered the documents, returning them to the safe as Sarah moved to the window. Two riders were approaching. One she recognized as James Miller, the bank manager who'd given her such a cold welcome yesterday. The other was a stranger, expensively dressed despite the dust of travel. "That's Samuel Blackwood," Jake whispered, his voice tight with carefully controlled anger. "He claims to represent Eastern investors, but he's really their connection to the buyers in Silver City. Acts respectable in town, but I've seen him with the worst of them out by the old Carson place." Sarah watched as the two men dismounted, noting how the sheriff hurried to greet them with obvious deference. The magnitude of what she'd stumbled into settled over her like a heavy wool blanket in summer heat. This wasn't just about claim jumping or even murder. This was organized crime hiding behind a veneer of frontier respectability. Her carefully planned new life had just become far more complicated than she'd imagined. "I should have told you everything from the start," Jake admitted, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "But I wasn't sure who to trust anymore. These men, they've destroyed everything my family built here. William was the only one brave enough to stand against them, and now—" He trailed off, staring at the safe that held his dead brother's evidence. Sarah straightened her spine, years of maintaining classroom discipline lending steel to her voice. "Well, they haven't destroyed everything yet. Your brother may be gone, but his evidence remains, and now there are two of us to carry on his work." Jake stared at her in surprise, but she continued before he could object. "I came here looking for a husband and a new life. Instead, I found a cause worth fighting for. The question is, are you willing to trust me enough to help?" Jake studied Sarah's determined expression in the flickering lamplight of his study, seeing for the first time not just the refined Boston schoolteacher who'd arrived on yesterday's riverboat, but a potential ally in his family's desperate fight. The Missouri River churned past the window, its muddy waters carrying steamboats laden with the silver that had made Silver City both prosperous and dangerous. He moved to his desk, withdrawing a weathered leather journal from a hidden compartment. William kept detailed records of everything: shipments that went missing, witnesses who disappeared, bribes paid to local lawmen. "The corruption runs deeper than just claim jumping," Jake explained, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "Sheriff Thomas has been working with the Silver Creek Mining Company to squeeze out independent operators like us. They've been systematically taking over every claim along the river, using force when necessary." Sarah crossed the room to examine the journal's cramped handwriting, her skirts rustling against the worn floorboards. The careful documentation reminded her of her own gradebooks, neat rows of information telling a larger story. "Your brother was very thorough. But why hasn't anyone taken this evidence to the territorial authorities in Fort Worth?" Jake's bitter laugh held no humor. "The last man who tried, James Morrison, never made it past Abilene. They found his body in the Kansas River, weighted down with mining equipment. The territorial marshal there ruled it an accident, but everyone knew better. These men have connections everywhere between here and Tombstone. Sarah Miller stared at the crumpled letter in her trembling hands, her eyes fixed on the elegant script that had drawn her halfway across the country from Boston to Silver City. The trading post bustled around her as flatboats docked along the river, but she barely registered the activity. Jake Thompson stood before her, hat in hand, explaining how his brother Samuel, her intended husband, had died in a mining accident 6 weeks ago. The letters she'd been receiving, filled with promises of a new life together, had been written by Jake himself. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trading post's grimy windows as Sarah confronted Jake about his deception. His weathered face showed genuine remorse, but there was something else in his eyes, a desperate urgency she couldn't quite understand. When she declared her intention to return to Boston on the next riverboat, Jake's composure cracked. He revealed how claim jumpers had murdered their parents 3 months ago, working with corrupt Deputy William Davis to steal their family's riverside properties. The deputy's been helping them forge deed transfers, Jake explained, his voice barely above a whisper as he glanced nervously around the crowded trading post. They've been systematically taking over every profitable piece of land along the river. Samuel was gathering evidence when he died, if it was really an accident at all. Sarah felt her world spinning as she processed this information, her proper Boston sensibilities warring with her growing suspicion that Samuel's death had been no accident. The river trade was the lifeblood of Silver City, and controlling the shoreline meant controlling commerce itself. Deputy Davis had positioned himself as a respected lawman, but Sarah observed how the merchant seemed to flinch when he entered the trading post later that afternoon. His steel-gray eyes settled on her with uncomfortable intensity as Jake introduced her as his cousin from back east. The deputy's smile never reached those cold eyes. That evening, in the Thompson family's modest home overlooking the river, Sarah discovered Samuel's hidden journals. Pages of careful documentation detailed the deputy's corruption, property transfers, witness statements, and a complex web of connections to James Wilson, a wealthy merchant who'd arrived in Silver City 6 months ago. The same James Wilson who now controlled most of the prime riverside warehouses where goods were stored and traded. Jake explained how Samuel had been meticulously building a case to present to the territorial marshal. But the marshal's 3 days ride away in Tombstone, he said, frustration evident in his voice. And every time we try to send word, our messages get intercepted. Sarah found herself studying the careful handwriting in Samuel's journal, so similar to the letters she'd received. She'd come seeking marriage but found herself entangled in something far more dangerous. The next morning, Sarah watched from the trading post as Deputy Davis supervised the unloading of Wilson's latest shipment. Her trained teacher's eye noted how he documented the cargo, subtle discrepancies in his ledger that matched patterns Samuel had recorded. When Thomas Miller, an elderly shopkeeper, questioned the deputy's counts, Davis's hand casually brushed his gun belt. The old man quickly backed down. That night, over a simple supper, Sarah shared her observations with Jake. Samuel taught basic bookkeeping at the mining office, he explained. That's how he first noticed the irregularities. Sarah's mind raced. Her years of teaching arithmetic in Boston could prove useful here. Show me all of Samuel's records, she insisted. Every ledger, every note. There's a pattern here we can prove. Jake's eyes widened as he realized the sophisticated schoolmarm might be their best hope for justice. Catherine Davis, the deputy's wife, began visiting the trading post daily, watching Sarah with barely concealed suspicion. The woman's forced pleasantries carried veiled warnings about knowing one's place in Silver City. But Sarah had already made her decision. She may have come west for marriage, but she'd stay to finish what Samuel had started. The dead man's letters had brought her here for a reason. Perhaps not the one either of them had intended, but a purpose nonetheless. Each evening, Sarah and Jake pored over Samuel's documents, cross-referencing them with public records she'd requested access to under the guise of researching local history for her students. The corruption ran deeper than they'd imagined, with tendrils reaching into the territorial government itself. Sarah began teaching at the local school, establishing herself in the community while carefully gathering more evidence. She was no longer just a Boston schoolmarm. She had become Samuel's successor in more ways than Jake could have anticipated. The morning fog rolled thick off the river as Sarah made her way to the schoolhouse, her boots clicking against the wooden sidewalk. She'd noticed William Foster, the territorial marshal, lingering outside her classroom more frequently these days. His presence carried an unspoken threat, though he masked it behind a genteel tip of his hat and practiced smile. Sarah had learned that William's name appeared repeatedly in Samuel's documents, connected to suspicious land deals and missing claim records. Jake worked the trading post with renewed purpose, carefully noting which officials came to conduct routine inspections and which settlers suddenly abandoned their claims after visits from the marshal's deputies. He'd taken to sleeping in the storage room, a loaded Winchester never far from reach. The night before, he'd confided to Sarah that he'd spotted unfamiliar riders watching the post from the ridgeline, their silhouettes dark against the setting sun. Catherine Miller, whose husband had lost their homestead under mysterious circumstances, began visiting Sarah after school hours. Her quiet testimony filled in crucial gaps in Samuel's investigation. The pattern was clear. Settlers who refused to sell their claims to William's associates faced escalating harassment until they fled or met with accidents. Sarah documented everything in a cipher of her own design, one that looked like innocent lesson plans to prying eyes. The situation grew more complex when James Turner, a young deputy with a conscience, sought out Jake at the trading post. Under cover of examining trade goods, he whispered warnings about William's plans to handle the schoolmarm situation before she could make contact with the territorial governor. Sarah's letters to the capital requesting certain records had not gone unnoticed. Emma, the washerwoman who serviced both the marshal's office and the saloon, proved an unexpected ally. Her keen ears caught snippets of conversation between William and his conspirators, which she relayed through carefully folded notes hidden in Sarah's clean linens. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, revealing a web of corruption that had strangled Silver City for years. Sarah found herself jumping at shadows, studying every face that passed her classroom window. She maintained her composure before her students, but her nights were restless. Jake had taken to walking her home each evening, his hand never far from his holster. They spoke in whispers about Samuel's final letters, which hinted at evidence hidden somewhere along the river, evidence that could bring down William's entire operation. One rain-soaked evening, as thunder rolled across the valley, Sarah discovered a false bottom in Samuel's old desk. Inside lay a leather pouch containing land deeds and banking records. The missing pieces that proved William and his associates had been forging documents and strong-arming legitimate claims for years. But the discovery came at a cost. The desk had been under surveillance, and within hours, William's men made their move. Jake spotted the riders approaching the schoolhouse just as Sarah was finishing her lessons. Through the gathering dusk, he counted 6 men, their faces obscured by bandanas. The children had barely cleared the schoolyard when the first shots rang out, splintering the freshly painted doorframe. Sarah's heart pounded as Jake pulled her through the back window, the precious documents clutched to her chest as they fled into the deepening shadows along the riverbank. They spent that night in a cave Jake had used for storing trade goods, listening to horses thunder past in the darkness. Sarah's Boston sensibilities had long since given way to frontier pragmatism, but she still shivered at how quickly her life had transformed from teaching arithmetic to dodging bullets. Jake kept watch at the cave mouth, his face grim in the moonlight, as Sarah worked by lantern light to organize their evidence for the territorial governor. The next morning brought news that William had declared them both wanted for theft and conspiracy, turning the very law they sought to defend against them. But Sarah had come too far to back down now. Samuel's letters had brought her west for justice, and she would see it done, or die trying, just as he had. As dawn broke over the river, she and Jake began plotting their dangerous journey to the territorial capital, knowing that William's men would be watching every trail and ford between Silver City and Justice. The morning mist clung to the river like a shroud as Jake led them downstream, keeping to the shallows where their horses' hooves wouldn't echo against the rocky banks. Sarah's fingers traced the edges of Samuel's last letter in her pocket. Not the fabricated ones Jake had written, but the real final message her intended had penned before William's men silenced him. The paper had grown soft from countless readings, but its words remained sharp as steel in her mind. Through the tangle of riverside willows, they caught glimpses of riders on the bluffs above, silhouetted against the pale sky. William had stationed men at every high point overlooking the traditional routes to the territorial capital. But Jake, having spent years moving trade goods along these waters, new paths that even his corrupt brother couldn't anticipate. They followed ancient deer trails and abandoned indigenous trading routes, places where the river's countless bends created hidden passages through the landscape. The storm clouds gathering over Silver City matched Sarah Miller's dark mood as she confronted Jake Thompson in the dusty street outside the Mercantile. Her Boston sensibilities had been shattered upon discovering that William Thompson, her intended husband through their months of correspondence, had been dead these past weeks. The letters that had drawn her across the continent had come from Jake's hand instead, a deception that burned like acid in her chest. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Jake gripped her arm, his weathered face etched with desperation. "You don't understand, Miss Miller. The claim jumpers who killed our parents. They've got Deputy Samuel Davis in their pocket. William was gathering evidence before they got to him too. I needed help, someone from outside who wouldn't raise suspicion. That's why I kept writing in his name." Sarah jerked away, her crisp blue dress swirling around her ankles. "So you thought deceiving a schoolteacher would somehow help? I should be on the next stage to Tombstone." But even as the words left her mouth, she caught sight of a cluster of rough-looking men emerging from the Golden Nugget Saloon, their eyes fixed predatorily on Jake. Among them was Deputy Davis, his tin star catching the fading sunlight. Catherine Wilson, the local dressmaker who had taken Sarah under her wing, hurried across the street to join them. "Jake, they're making their move. James Thompson was seen riding hard from your family's river landing. The whole shipment of mining equipment's gone missing." Catherine's whispered words carried the weight of catastrophe. The Thompson family's river trading business was all Jake had left. Jake's face hardened as he watched Deputy Davis and his men approach. "Miss Miller, I know you've got every right to hate me, but those men murdered my brother and parents over control of the river trade. Every lawman in 3 counties is either bought or terrified into silence. Will you help us expose them?" His eyes held a raw honesty that made Sarah's resolve waver. The pieces began falling into place in Sarah's mind. The suspicious deaths of Jake's family, the missing shipments, the way certain merchants seemed to prosper while others mysteriously failed. She had come west seeking adventure and romance, but instead found herself embroiled in a web of corruption that threatened to strangle Silver City's very future. Catherine pressed a folded paper into Sarah's hands. "William's ledger. He kept track of every bribe, every threatened merchant, every stolen shipment. But we need someone they won't suspect to get it to the territorial marshal in Fort Worth." The dressmaker's usually cheerful face was drawn with worry. "They watch all of us too closely." Sarah felt the weight of the document, heavier than its physical presence. Her proper Boston upbringing warred with the steel she'd discovered in her spine since arriving in Silver City. "I came here to be a bride, not a spy," she said softly. But even as she spoke, her mind was already forming plans. Who would suspect a disappointed mail-order bride of carrying incriminating evidence? Deputy Davis's voice cut through their hushed conversation. "Jake Thompson, time we had us a talk about that missing shipment." His hand rested meaningfully on his gun belt as his companions spread out in a menacing half-circle. Sarah could see the calculation in their eyes. With William's death still fresh, another Thompson tragedy wouldn't raise too many eyebrows. In that moment, Sarah made her decision. Drawing herself up to her full height, she stepped between Jake and the approaching men. "Deputy Davis, how fortunate. I was just about to call on you. It seems my intended has passed away, and I find myself in need of an escort back to Abilene. Surely you wouldn't mind accompanying a lady?" Her voice dripped with manufactured sweetness as she watched confusion ripple across the corrupt lawman's face. The tension crackled like the approaching lightning as Sarah maintained her innocent smile, knowing the deputy couldn't refuse without raising suspicions. Behind her, she felt Jake and Catherine quietly slip away. She had bought them time. Time to gather more evidence. Time to contact the territorial marshal. Time to save what remained of the Thompson family legacy. As Deputy Davis struggled to maintain his friendly facade, Sarah allowed herself a small, secret smile. She had come west seeking a husband but found something far more meaningful, a cause worth fighting for, and perhaps, in Jake's determined eyes, a love born of truth rather than deception. The storm was about to break over Silver City, and Sarah Miller intended to be its lightning rod. The storm broke with savage intensity as Sarah kept Deputy Davis occupied at the Silver City Hotel's restaurant. Her forced small talk a counterpoint to the thunder rattling the windows. Through the rain-streaked glass, She caught glimpses of Jake and Catherine moving purposefully through the muddy streets toward the claims office. Her heart raced, knowing they carried documents that would expose Davis's web of corruption and the claim-jumping scheme that had cost so many their land. Lightning illuminated the deputy's face, and Sarah noticed the subtle tightening around his eyes as he glanced at the clock for the third time. He knew something was amiss, and she could sense his growing unease. She launched into another lengthy story about Boston society, all while watching his gun hand inch closer to his holster beneath the table. The wind howled through Silver City's streets, driving sheets of rain against the buildings as Jake and Catherine reached the claims office. Inside, they found exactly what they'd feared. Records altered, dates changed, ownership transferred through a maze of fraudulent documents. But mixed among the papers was something unexpected. A letter bearing the territorial marshal's seal, warning of an investigation into recent land disputes along the river. Sarah's carefully crafted facade cracked when gunshots echoed from the direction of the claims office. Deputy Davis's chair scraped across the wooden floor as he stood, his friendly mask finally slipping. "You've been stalling me," he snarled, reaching for his weapon. But Sarah was already moving, upending the heavy oak table between them as more shots rang out in the storm-darkened street. Through the chaos of overturned furniture and startled diners, Sarah ran for the back door, her skirts gathered in one hand. The rain soaked her instantly as she emerged into the alley, her mind racing with possibilities. Jake and Catherine had found something important. Important enough for Davis's men to risk open gunfire in the middle of town. The sound of horses' hooves on wet cobblestones drew her attention to the main street, where she glimpsed riders moving through the downpour. Among them was Thomas, Jake's youngest brother, leading a group of rivermen they'd recruited from the trading post downstream. They'd arrived right on schedule, just as Jake had planned. Inside the claims office, Jake and Catherine worked frantically by lamplight, copying the most damning documents as bullets splintered the window frames. The evidence was irrefutable. Davis and his conspirators had systematically stolen land from families all along the river, using the law itself as their weapon. The murdered Thompson parents had been just one link in a chain of violence stretching from Silver City to Fort Worth. The storm's fury matched the gunfight that erupted in the streets. Sarah picked her way through the shadows, armed with the small derringer she'd kept hidden in her boot since leaving Boston. She was no longer the naive schoolmarm who'd arrived seeking romance. Silver City had transformed her into something stronger, someone willing to fight for justice alongside the man she'd grown to love. Thomas and his rivermen engaged Davis's corrupted deputies, the exchange of gunfire nearly lost in the thunder. Sarah reached the claims office's side door just as Jake and Catherine finished securing the evidence. Their eyes met in the lightning-lit darkness, and without words, they knew their next move. They had to reach the telegraph office before Davis could alert his conspirators in Abilene. The rain continued its assault as they moved through the town's muddy back streets, the precious documents protected beneath Jake's coat. Sarah thought of the letters that had brought her west, of Samuel's death and Jake's deception, of all the twists of fate that had led to this moment. She realized that sometimes love and justice arrived in unexpected packages, wrapped in lies that gave way to deeper truths. Thunder crashed overhead as they approached the telegraph office, its windows glowing like beacons in the storm. Inside, they found the operator face down on his desk, unconscious but breathing. Catherine quickly took his place at the key, her fingers flying as she transmitted their evidence to both the territorial marshal and the authorities in Abilene. The truth about Silver City's corruption would soon echo far beyond its rain-soaked streets. The telegraph key's rhythmic clicking was suddenly drowned out by splintering wood as Davis and his deputies burst through the back door, their guns drawn. Jake spun around, positioning himself between Sarah and the intruders, while Catherine continued transmitting, her hand steady despite the chaos erupting behind her. The precious documents scattered across the floor as thunder shook the building's foundation. "Step away from that telegraph," Davis snarled, his face twisted with desperate fury. "You've got no idea what you're dealing with. This goes beyond Silver City. There are powerful men in Abilene who'll make sure none of you leave this room alive if that message goes through." Sarah's mind raced to the hidden derringer in her skirt pocket, a gift from Jake she'd initially refused but now clutched like a lifeline. Through the window, she caught glimpses of townspeople gathering in the rain-soaked street, drawn by the commotion. The truth of Silver City's corruption would have witnesses one way or another. Jake's voice cut through the tension, steady as steel. It's already done, Davis. Sarah Miller watched from behind a fallen oak as Deputy William Thompson handed a leather pouch to the claim jumper's leader. Even in the dim moonlight, the glint of gold was unmistakable. After weeks of gathering evidence with Jake Davis, they finally had proof of the deputy's corruption. Her heart raced as she thought of how different her life had become since arriving in Silver City, expecting to marry Jake's brother Samuel, only to find Samuel murdered and a web of corruption that had claimed both Davis' parents. Jake squeezed her arm gently, his presence reassuring as they documented the illicit exchange. In the months since she'd decided to stay and help expose the truth, their relationship had evolved from reluctant allies to something deeper. She'd discovered Jake was nothing like the gruff, suspicious man who'd initially greeted her arrival. His determination to protect honest settlers along the river and expose the corrupt law enforcement that enabled claim jumpers had awakened something in her proper Boston heart. The evidence they'd gathered painted a damning picture. Deputy Thompson had been taking bribes to look the other way while the claim jumpers terrorized legitimate mining operations along the river. Several families had been forced out, their claims stolen through a combination of violence and fraudulent paperwork filed with Thompson's help. The Davis family's refusal to be intimidated had cost Samuel and his parents their lives. Sarah reflected on how her teaching skills had proved unexpectedly useful in their investigation. She'd taken a position at the Silver City School, which gave her access to town records and allowed her to document discrepancies in claim registrations without arousing suspicion. The schoolmarm's reputation for fastidious record-keeping had proved the perfect cover for gathering evidence of Thompson's corruption. A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness, causing Sarah to start. Jake's hand moved to his holster as shadows detached themselves from the trees. James Wilson, the senior deputy, emerged with several armed men. Sarah's heart sank. They'd walked into a trap. Thompson had known they were watching and arranged this meeting to draw them out. She felt Jake tense beside her as they found themselves surrounded. "Well, well, the schoolmarm and the grieving brother," Wilson drawled, his badge catching the moonlight. "Quite the pair of amateur detectives you've turned out to be. Though I suppose we should thank you. Made it much easier to identify who needed silencing when you started asking all those questions." His cold smile made Sarah's blood run cold. She knew they were unlikely to survive this encounter, but Jake and Sarah had planned for this possibility. As Wilson raised his pistol, a volley of shots rang out from the darkness. Territorial Marshal Thomas Miller and his deputies had been watching from concealed positions, having shadowed Sarah and Jake for weeks as they built their case. The corrupt lawmen and claim jumpers found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire. In the chaos that followed, Sarah's world narrowed to flashes of gunfire and Jake's protective presence as they scrambled for cover. She'd never imagined her search for marriage would lead her into such danger, but neither could she regret the path that had brought her here. The corruption that had festered in Silver City needed to be exposed, and justice needed to be served, not just for the Davis family, but for all the honest settlers who'd suffered. When the shooting stopped, Wilson, Thompson, and several claim jumpers lay dead or wounded. The survivors were quickly rounded up and shackled. Marshal Miller commended Sarah and Jake for their role in exposing the corruption, though he scolded them for taking such risks. The evidence they'd gathered, combined with witness testimonies from other victims, would ensure the remaining conspirators faced justice. In the weeks that followed, Silver City began to heal. New deputies were appointed, and legitimate claims were restored to their rightful owners. Sarah continued teaching, though she now shared the Davis homestead with Jake as his wife. They'd found love in the midst of danger and justice in the face of corruption. While it wasn't the marriage she'd originally sought, Sarah had discovered that sometimes life's unexpected turns led to the truest happiness. The river trade flourished as honest settlers returned, knowing their rights would be protected. Jake and Sarah became respected figures in the community, their story a reminder that justice could prevail even in the darkest circumstances. They raised their children on tales of courage and integrity, ensuring the next generation understood the importance of standing against corruption and fighting for what was right. Years later, Sarah would sometimes take out Samuel's letters, the ones that had brought her west, and reflect on how fate had led her to such an unexpected destiny. She'd come seeking a simple marriage and found instead a cause worth fighting for and a love worth risking everything to protect. The proper Boston schoolmarm had become a frontier legend, proving that true strength often came in the most unexpected packages. The years had changed Abilene's riverfront, but the core of what Jake and Sarah had built remained strong. Their trading post had grown into a proper merchant house, and their reputation for fair dealing had spread up and down the river. The claim jumpers' reign of terror had become a cautionary tale parents told their children, while Sarah and Jake's stand against corruption inspired a new generation of settlers determined to build their lives honestly. On quiet evenings, Sarah would sit on their wide porch overlooking the river, watching the sunset paint the water gold. She'd think of Samuel sometimes, not with regret, but with gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought her to this life. Jake would join her, their comfortable silence built on years of shared struggles and triumphs. Their eldest daughter, Catherine, had inherited Sarah's teaching spirit, starting a proper school in what had once been just a collection of riverside shacks. The old sheriff's badge, tarnished and pitted, hung in Jake's study as a reminder of darker days. William, the corrupt lawman who'd protected the claim jumpers, had died in prison 3 years after his conviction, never showing remorse for his role in the deaths of Jake's parents. But his downfall had sparked changes throughout the territory, as communities began demanding more accountability from their law enforcement. Trading vessels now moved freely along the river, their crews no longer fearing ambush or extortion. Jake and Sarah's youngest son, Thomas, had taken to the river life, piloting his own boat between Silver City and Fort Worth. He carried not just cargo but news and connections, strengthening the bonds between river communities that had once lived in isolation and fear. Emma, their middle child, had married a young deputy from Tombstone who'd heard tales of her parents stand against corruption and come to Abilene seeking to learn from Jake's example. Together, they worked to maintain the legacy of justice that had been built from such painful beginnings. The claim jumpers' old territories had been transformed into productive farms and honest businesses. Sarah's Boston sensibilities had softened over the years, though she never lost her proper bearing entirely. She'd learned to shoot straight, ride hard, and navigate the complex social waters of frontier life while maintaining her dedication to education and civility. The library she'd established had grown into a cultural center, drawing settlers who valued more than just survival. Jake's nightmares about his parents' murders had gradually faded, replaced by pride in the community they'd helped build and the family they'd raised. He'd found peace in the knowledge that he'd not only avenged their deaths but had created something positive from tragedy. The river trade they'd protected had brought prosperity to hundreds of families who might otherwise have been driven away by fear and corruption. Their story became part of river lore, told and retold at trading posts and taverns along the waterways. But the truth was richer than any tale. It was written in the thriving towns, the safe passages, and the generations of children who grew up knowing that one person's stand for justice could change the course of many lives. The letters that had brought Sarah west remained carefully preserved, a testament to how love could grow from deception when truth and courage prevailed. As Sarah watched her grandchildren play in the yard where she'd once faced down armed claim jumpers, she reflected on how completely her life had transformed from her days as a Boston schoolmarm. The proper young woman who'd boarded that train seeking a conventional marriage had found instead an adventure that reshaped not just her own destiny, but the future of an entire region. The river flowing past their home carried more than trade goods now. It carried hope, justice, and the promise of a better tomorrow. Sarah's weathered hands traced the faded ink of those first letters as she sat on the porch of the riverside trading post that had grown into a thriving merchant's hall. 30 years had passed since she'd discovered Jake's deception about his brother Samuel's death. But that revelation had set in motion events that transformed the lawless river territories into bastions of justice. The corrupt Sheriff William, who'd turned a blind eye to the claim jumpers' reign of terror, now served as a cautionary tale in the region's history. Through the window, she could see her eldest daughter Elizabeth teaching in the very schoolhouse Sarah had insisted on building after the dust settled. It had become more than just a place of learning. It was a symbol of how civilization had finally taken root along these untamed waters. The river that once carried whispered threats now bore legitimate commerce, and the trading families who'd lived in fear could sleep soundly, knowing their properties were protected by proper law. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention as Thomas, her youngest son, rode in from his patrol of the river boundaries.